Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Apsara Sabaratnam, and I'm here with Min-Hui Lo and Martin Wong. So we're really excited about running this session here with you. What we might, the session is effectively about, the whole aim of it is to develop all of our collective cultural intelligences, and there are so many ways in which we can go about doing it. And so we've put it together. This is a starting point, and we always say you can do a lot of learning around this area, but this is something that we have put together as a 101 in this area. So it's really for us to think about it from a point of view of when we start a journey or we're somewhere in the journey, but like wanting to build our understanding and our understanding and our intelligences, and so that we are better able to communicate and interact with other people. But what it enables us to do is to develop our intrapersonal skills as well as our interpersonal skills when working with people across cultural backgrounds, a wide range of cultural backgrounds. So I'd like to say I'm here dialing in from Nam. I'm in the CBD, and I am on Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, and I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on stolen lands, and that much of this cultural intelligence that we are working on and developing within ourselves is part and parcel, and a very important part of walking alongside our brothers and sisters towards self-determination and treaties. So I think it's very important for us to remember that this session here today is about developing those skill sets, and those skill sets that hold us in good stead when we work as allies, as well as working alongside people from diverse backgrounds. So I just want to say before we get started as well, is that the whole idea of this is that we really want to develop really strong cross-cultural relationships. And so that for me is a very important thing. And the idea of this is so that we can actually develop greater understanding and find ways in which we can be a lot more inclusive. So last session that Min-Hui ran was all about looking at our privileges, and then also thinking about how do we use our privileges in an effective way to create inclusive spaces. So really this is about taking that next step and working alongside that. So I'll just let you read more of this, but I just wanted to say before we get started that there's 3 of us here facilitating, and I'll introduce all 3 members here. Okay, so there's Min-Hui Lo, who is here with us. And Min-Hui is of Chinese heritage, and her mother is Chinese Malaysian, and her father is Chinese and grew up in Myanmar. Min-Hui is born in Australia and has been raised and lived her whole life here in Australia as well, but of course has connections to family members in both in Malaysia and in Australia. And Myanmar, my mistake. And Martin is here as well, Martin Wong. And he's the convener of Multicultural Greens Victoria, and he's Malaysian Chinese Australian. He was born in Australia, but grew up in Malaysia, and he's back in Melbourne studying at university. And myself, so my name's Apsara, and I'm Secretary of Multicultural Greens Victoria. I'm Sri Lankan Tamil. I was born in Sri Lanka, but left Sri Lanka when I was very young, and grew up in Zambia and Zimbabwe before coming to Australia in 1990. So all 3 of us are effectively third culture kids. We were born, we are have our cultural heritage and our ethnicities and whatever, but of course, growing up in other countries has meant that there are some great aspects of it, like we've been able to be exposed to other cultural views and expanded our worldviews and things like that. We've been able to develop some of our cultural intelligences during these, during these periods where we've spent extended periods of time in different parts of the world. But it also means, like for me, I sometimes don't feel very Tamil, and I don't feel like I necessarily can understand my own culture in the kind of nuanced way. For example, other Tamil people might, because they're born in Sri Lanka, grew up in Sri Lanka, been socialized in Sri Lankan culture. And so therefore, sometimes I also feel like I don't quite fit in Sri Lanka, but I don't quite fit in Australia as well. And I don't want to speak on the behalf of Martin and Min-Hui, but lots of us face that. And so it's something that I just wanted to talk about. And yeah, so that kind of thing means that as well is that we have grown up and been socialized in a number of different cultures, but it also means that it comes with a whole bunch of other challenges as well. So I just wanted to introduce that concept and talk a little bit about the fact that we're here talking about it, but recognizing that we're not the vessels of all knowledge as well. So just before we go to any to the discussion here, is anyone else here that was born in a country but grew up grew up somewhere else, for example? Is anyone in the group who faces that?
Yeah.
Greta, would you be able to share with us?
Sorry, do you mean was born here but grew up somewhere else? So what do you mean?
Born in your home country, but then grew up somewhere else, or does that make sense? So
not really, no then.
You're Scottish, right? But you were born in Scotland.
Yeah, no, I guess it's not me.
Yes. Anyone else here who was born in your home country or spent a lot of your childhood in another country? No, okay. So we're going to get started, and I'm going to talk a little bit about culture and just introduce this concept to you. I want you to think about culture from a perspective of an onion, okay? So if we were to cut an onion in half, I just want you to think about it from that perspective. How would we view a culture? So really the outside of the onion is the skin, and that is the one that is most visible to people, and that is our behavior. So when you see someone who is not from your own culture and you see something in their behavior, that's something that's quite distinct, and you go, oh, the way someone's behaving is different to the way I behave. However, really, if we want to understand culture or someone's culture, we need to actually go to the core of that onion, and we need to think about some of the values that, the underpinning values that shape people's behavior. Those underpinning values that, what that does is creates a social norms, the norms within that particular society in which we're living in that are seen to be okay. These norms are taught to us from a very young age. So we're, because of our socialization in our societies, so, you know, taught through our family members, through schooling, through the media, politics, and so this is how these social norms are passed from one generation to the next. And what does that actually do? It shapes your beliefs and attitudes, okay? And so those beliefs and attitudes that you have are shaped over a period of time. And what we see from someone who is outside of your culture is your behavior, okay? So that is understanding culture from the fact that the one that we that most visible is the behavior, but to really gain an understanding of one's culture, we really need to go to the core of that, of your, so to understand the behavior, we need to go to the core and to understand the values that drive that behavior. So what we also need to remember is that when we are looking at values within a culture, there are two parts to values. So there's core values and secondary values, okay? So we need to also understand that there are some values within a culture that are pretty steadfast. They do change, but very extremely slowly. but there are other aspects of a culture which are more secondary values, which are more likely to be changing a lot more rapidly. And so obviously, when we are looking at people and looking at the way in which they're behaving over a period of time, you will see there will be underpinning core values that hold strong, whereas of course those secondary values can change quite dramatically. I mean, just even looking at here in Australia, I remember when I first came to Australia in 1990, so my family moved to Australia from Zimbabwe in 1990. Just giving you an example of secondary values, just simple things like if you were looking at rental properties in Melbourne, you would find that if there was a property that was close to public transport in 1990, most people like kind of stayed clear of that property. Okay, that was because they were like, okay, I don't want to be near train stations. Like the kind of people that hang out around train stations are like undesirable, and it's noisy and things like that. But what we know is that over the last 30 years, if you have a look at advertising for real estate or, you know, like rental properties, they actually put the actual distance from the home to public transport. So let's say it's a tram stop or a train station. So what we can see here is over a period of time, there has been a shift in secondary values. That is not a core value. Does that make sense? So obviously as a government or as or organizations, they have recognized those shifts, and therefore we can see here real estate business. I'm just using an example of that. Real estate businesses have also shifted their messaging to take into account secondary values. So I think as, you know, we in the climate movement need to, I think, understand core values is very important, but also recognize that there are secondary values that are shifting over periods of time. And we need to tap into these. Of course, we need to tap into core values, but we also need to tap into shifting secondary values as well. Any questions about this before I move to the next part? Okay, the other thing I just want to say before we continue is that when we look at behavior, just solely look at behavior, what we are doing is making judgment calls, and we are stereotyping. So if I say, oh, all Vietnamese people behave in this way because I saw one Vietnamese person behave in that way, I'm effectively stereotyping and labeling every Vietnamese people to behave in this way. However, if I took a step back and I said, okay, I just saw someone behave in this way who is from a Vietnamese background, what are the values that might be underpinning the reason why they might behave in this way? What I'm trying to do there is to shift away from stereotyping to more generalizing. Okay, so that's what we're trying to get you to do, is rather than stereotyping people and saying all Vietnamese people behave in this way, is try to get that deeper understanding of why someone might behave in a way that is different to the way we are behaving. So that's what I just wanted to talk about. And really the whole aim of today's session, I mean, today you're here because, of course, you are very interested in learning new information and taking in and absorbing this new information. So we can see from that perspective, it's all about the metacognition, okay? And cultural intelligence that is the first step, and it's a very important step, because if no one takes that first step, we are not going to be moving towards this, towards cultural intelligence. So I think it's very important for people to take that first step, and I think it's really excellent. The other thing that is a very important ingredient is that the knowledge on its own is not enough. We also have to have this real interest and curiosity and this openness to learning from other people. So stepping back from our judgment and actually listening from other people, their perspectives, their reasoning, their understanding, the values that underpin the way in which they do things, because we have a lot to learn from other people when we actually take that step back and we go to people with an open mind and a willingness to learn and take on board new information. And so that's, I think, the second part, which is the whole idea of the motivation. But most important in cultural intelligence is the third part, we need behavioral changes for us to be able to develop this skill set. And what that requires us to do is to say, no, I'm not going to expect other people to adapt the way they behave when we are interacting with people from culturally diverse background. It's my job to do that. Okay, it's my job to understand that I need to be able to adapt the way in which I'm behaving, and taking on board practices and customs that maybe maybe I'm familiar with in my own culture, but one that is going to enhance my understanding, my relationships, and my interactions with diverse other people from different cultural backgrounds. Is there any questions about this before I continue on to the next part? No? Okay. Actually, I should maybe, if there's any message, if there's any, I'll actually make sure I'm looking at the chat box as well. Or if anyone does want to ask questions whilst I'm talking, please don't feel shy about stopping me to ask some questions as well. Okay, so I'm more than happy to do that. So remembering we are looking at the first step, which is really about the metacognition and learning information. There is a lot of information out there in relation to cultural intelligence. And there are many, many frameworks that are out there. Of course, we don't want to just give you so much information in your first session and just say, okay, here's all the information available. We want you to think about how you can, go out and learn more information and use different frameworks. So we're going to, in today's session, only use one framework, and this is a framework that was developed by Gert Hofstede. Now, Gert Hofstede himself, obviously, I want to be very clear, came up with this model, and this model, I'm not saying is the be all and end all, and it is one of many, many models out there. So I just want to be very clear about that. But how do we start this process if we don't even look at one? So I'm going to talk, just introduce who he is in a very short way, and maybe talk a little bit about what his study is about before we actually jump into our activities, so that you get to understand a little bit about why we're going into this. So Gert Hofstede worked for IBM, and he is a psychologist, and he worked in the area of organization behavior. And he was working at IBM in the 1970s, and he recognized when he was working there that when working across the divisions all around the world, that his colleagues in different parts of the world didn't necessarily think in the same way he did, didn't necessarily conceptualize ideas in the same way, did not communicate in the same way, sometimes worked in ways that were quite different to the way he worked. And this is when he started to say, why is it that my work colleagues who are working in the same organization may not necessarily behave in the same way that I do? And this is when he started to think about what are those underpinning factors. And this is when he started to look at values, okay, the underpinning values that are driving the behavior of his work colleagues, which might be different to their counterparts and himself and people around the world. So what he actually did was, because he actually worked in training and development at IBM, was he commenced undertaking in-depth interviews and surveys in the offices around the world, so that he could actually start to unpack why this was the case and get a better understanding of the underpinning factors. And this is when he started to see that, looking at that cultural values is very important for him, unpacking behavior. I want to be very clear. This is, this model has many limitations, and, the limitations, of course, are a very long list. We have to remember, firstly, that this is a study that was undertaken just in one company, which was IBM, okay, of employees who worked in that particular organization. So that in itself is a limitation. Of course, he was undertaking interviews and things like that, but, you know, remembering the nuances of culture, you know, when he is actually analyzing in-depth interview responses and things like that, you're not necessarily going to pick up on the cultural nuances of responses and the way in which people interact. So we have to remember that there are those kind of limitations as well. We also, you know, there has been a lot of criticisms of the fact that when he talks about his models, it's as if it's only about the factor that influences people's behavior is culture. We need to remember there are many other factors, including internal factors that influence the way in which we behave. So this is just one of many factors for us to consider. Now I saw a question from Nick. Nick, are you able to maybe jump on and ask that question? Because then maybe Min-Hui, myself, and Martin can also answer.
Yeah. I guess I'm interested in the role of metaphors when we talk about values and talk about like our cultural framing, I guess. And I was just interested to know if Gert, if that came up in his research at all, like if there was like different metaphors or even idioms that people had in different cultures that like implied values and how that communication was dealt with, or whether it was addressed, or yeah, and also whether if any of the facilitators had any experience with that, the communication of values through metaphors.
Maybe I'll get Min-Hui, because Min-Hui has a much better critique of it than I do. So I think maybe, do you mind if I hand over to Min-Hui to answer your question, Nick?
So this isn't an answer of the first part. I mean, the thing about, and I think you probably know, I mean, the thing about metaphors is that metaphors are a very good, like if you were to study metaphors, like if you were to speak to someone from another culture and ask them what their idioms and metaphors were, I think it'd be a nice entry point into a very sort of specific, like, you know, sort of cultural knowledge or area. I don't know how it would depend on the metaphor in question as to sort of how much you'd be able to gain from it. So for example, for me, as Apsara did say, so my parents are Chinese, but they've never lived in China, right? And they grew up, but they were Chinese educated by, you know, so for example, for my mum, Chinese Malaysians set up Chinese language schools, and they taught a lot of Chinese literature and Chinese whatever. So there are a lot of Chinese metaphors and idioms that really require, it's sort of like you know, like English metaphors and idioms, right? A rolling stone gathers no moss. If you don't sort of understand what people are trying to tell you by a rolling stone and moss, you sort of, you know, like if someone used that on you, you'd be like, I'm not sure. Like I can probably guess from context what you mean, but I'm not, you know, it's there's a lot of nuance there. Maybe not in the rolling stone one, but there's a lot of nuance there that I know that I might not pick up on. So if we're talking about using metaphors when we're working with people we don't know, like for example in activist groups, if we're talking about, so like the case study is Indian activists working with Australian activists, I wouldn't throw those out there because it's a bit fraught, it's a bit dangerous. But if it's someone that you know well, like I've got colleagues who grew up overseas and whatever, metaphors are a fun way to unpack, like, you know, the things that not even your culture, because a lot of metaphors are really dated, right? A lot of metaphors are from like not medieval times, but like many centuries ago, and you know what they mean because people keep using them, but like they're not immediately, then the imagery used is not necessarily the imagery that's relevant to you as a population now. So it's a fun way to talk about your history and, sort of shared folklore and whatever. And that certainly gives you a very rich understanding of a certain cultural pocket. But yeah, I probably would save it for when you know someone well enough that they know what your intent, like they know what you're like as a person. So, there's no sort of risk of huge offense, if there's a misunderstanding. Martin, have I covered everything that you would cover?
Oh, yeah. Hello, Nick. It's been a while. It's good to see you. Yeah, I don't really have much to add. I think I very much agree with what you said.
And I think also with what Mink has also said here, Mink, would you just like to maybe jump on and explain what you've just said?
I've taught English for a long time, and English is a second language. But even teaching English to young secondary school students, you become aware of metaphors that we all use without realizing that we're using them. So for me, in answer to Nick's question about Hofstede, I've read lots of Hofstede. I don't remember him talking about metaphors, but in terms of intercultural communication, metaphors, yeah, absolutely. But for me, the most important thing is that we may not know that we are using them. So when we say, and when I often realize that someone has used one is if they, unfortunately, these days use the term literally before, and then you realize that what follows is actually a metaphor because it's ridiculous. I was literally starving of starving. That is actually a metaphor. It doesn't mean that the person is literally starving. And that's something that could be misinterpreted by somebody who hears the words. So for me, the thing about metaphors is becoming aware of your own cultural metaphors so that when you're working with others, you're being thoughtful so that you're not using them as Min said. But so often we don't realize that we're using them.
Yep, that's
right. I would actually even add to that. There's also like another it's not a super important thing, but another cultural sort of tendency is whether you exaggerate things or understate things. That's a very so like, for example, I think there was a sort of tongue-in-cheek internet post that was talking about the difference between Americans and people from probably England, and they were talking about how for Americans, for small things, you're like, oh, that was amazing, that was fantastic, that was whatever, but for the other side, there's a lot of, oh, you know what, it wasn't terrible, it was surprisingly not too bad. And there's if you don't have background knowledge of where people are pitching what they're saying, it's very hard to get a good grasp on how, for example, enthusiastic they are about something. And if you're reading too much into that, you can, there's room for offense. And that's just, I think for cultural intelligence, it's just, I think the most important thing is as Nick did say, to try to be aware. You're not going to be able to be aware of everything, but to try to not, as Apsara said, put your, to come with your sort of, to realize that, yes, everything that you do is tinged with your own cultural assumptions, and to try to be as aware of that as possible in all of your communications. So that, if you do use a metaphor, if everyone around the table is, sort of willing to like, oh, what the, and then work it out with no hard feelings, well, it's okay that there are misunderstandings. We'll work through it.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I think it is one of those things where we kind of also fall into those patterns. But with Gert Hofstede, I just want to be very clear. There are many limitations, but it's a great starting point. And after this session, I will, probably tomorrow sometime, I will go and get a whole range of other frameworks that you could also look at. So the idea being is that you're not relying on one framework only, but relying on multiple frameworks to build that understanding. And it really is about building understanding and gaining more knowledge, and really not being afraid to make mistakes, because we all make mistakes when we interact with other people. But if you do make mistakes and things like that, acknowledging that mistake and of learning about more about things from the context of the other person is, I think, very important. So when he introduced this framework, he actually introduced the first four, and so that was about power distance. So remembering, and it was from 0 to 120. Okay, so that's the range that he used to score countries. Okay, and from 0, so in the case of power distance, we're talking about low power distance at closer to 0, and high power distance closer to 120. In the case of individualism, the opposite of that was collectivism. So any scores that are lower are closer to are considered to be collectivism, more towards collectivism. Anything that is closer to 120 is more towards individualism. The third one that he looked at was masculinity, and so he looked at that as a framework of masculinity and femininity. So closer to 0 is more about femininity, and closer to 120 is in that realm is towards masculinity. The other one, to uncertainty avoidance, that's a low and high. Okay, so it's low uncertainty avoidance and high uncertainty avoidance. So that's pretty straightforward. The last one there, framework that he used, well, that actually was in the 1980s by some researchers, was about short-term orientation, which is low. And then if it's long-term orientation, it's closer to 120. And the last one that is not here is about indulgence. So the score of indulgence is relating to pragmatism, which is closer to the 0, and indulgence closer to 120. So that is the framework we're going to be using in today's session. And when we do our activities, we are going to be going through each one of these. And I think we have 3 activities relating to 3 of these things here. So we're going to get started, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to be working in groups of 3 or 4, but I want to actually show you a little bit about this model, and because we're going to be using a case study about India, I've actually created the first part, and I just wanted to show you where did I get this information from, so that you also know in the future, or when you want to look for that information, you can actually find it. So I'm going to just click on here, and I'm going to quickly show you where the model is. Oh, I think I might have to go to this one here because I've opened it. I've got that many. Okay, so this is the actual website that he created, and you can actually, so you can compare countries here. So I might just show you. I'll just do this here, and you can. Okay, so you can put Australia, and like in the case of, I've got India there as well. You can. Okay, so there we go. So that was where I got that information from, and you can see here there's that extra lot, and effectively we can see how he has compared. You can actually do multiple countries as well. So like I can put Japan here, for example, and I can now compare 3 countries on that. I can actually go up to about, let's say I did Sweden as well. Okay, so we can actually see here. We're comparing 4 countries in this. Okay, so literally, as you can see, these are the rating ranges from 0 to 120, and that's what he did there. All right, so that's the first part I wanted to talk about. Now I want to talk to you about, go back and ask you to read an article. Okay, so I'm just going to get you, I'm going to go back to that. So I did, oh, sorry, my mistake, wrong one. Where is it? Yeah, okay, sorry. So give me one moment. I just have to maybe move something here. I've got so many, I'm so naughty. I have so many screens opens. So I think maybe that's because I haven't got it up. Okay, here we go. Just give me 1 second. I am got it now. Here we go. So I did, well, I thought as ways I would do that quickly, and I've actually put this comparison of Australia and India, which we'll be using. So the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to read this article that I sent you. I'm going to allocate 10 minutes for you to read the article, because that will give you some context for what we're going to cover. And once we have read that article, I will be going through with you about power distance. And then we actually break out into a group to work on. So once you've read this article, I'll just show you what we'll be doing. We'll be looking at power distance. And once we've looked at power distance, I'll talk a little bit about power distance. We will actually do an activity relating back to the case study. So the idea is that you get to read the case study and get some context about what the case study is about. If you want to highlight the case study, if you want to, do that, like that's why you'll have 10 minutes, and you can maybe go back and read it as well if you do finish it on time, or with a bit of time up your sleeve. So it's now 1:42. What about if we reconvene at 1:52? I'm going to put myself on silent, and if anyone has any questions, you're more than welcome to ask me the question. Okay, so just for your own thing, the article was sent to you, I think, by I sent you the article yesterday. Is that right? Has everyone got the article? Just checking in with everyone.
What was the email address?
Apsara Sabaratnam. Did you get that from me?
Probably. I just needed to find it.
Sure.
Sorry, you're talking about the case study, right?
Yes, the case study.
Okay, that's okay. If everyone goes into the chat, I posted a link to that just in.
I found it in my emails. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Lewin. Just checking in, do you need a little bit more time, like another 5 minutes? Or is everyone ready to proceed?
Ready?
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Min.
Is anyone else ready?
Yes, great. So you've all had a chance to read it in full, the article. Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the first one there. What I would like you to do, if you don't mind, if you can have maybe a double screen or a single screen, up to you. If you keep this screen open, and I will use the country comparison screen. So if you want to keep this one here, so you've got a bit of the notes here, but I will kind of expand beyond these notes here, okay, when I'm talking. So just so that you can actually have a look. So I was whilst you were doing that, I also I went online and I was thought I might just have a look at a couple of countries. So I'm going to use Australia, India, and Japan as my as the three that I'm just going to talk about, because then I can just use some examples as well. Okay, so whilst I'm talking about it, so in Hofstede's first one, first dimension he looked at was power distance, and he looked at tried to identify levels of power distance and what did power distance look like in different cultures. And what he did find like through his studies was that power distance varied quite greatly between countries, and there were some countries where power distance was very high, and in those countries there tended to be a lot more hierarchical in the societies. The hierarchies could come through in many ways. It's through the language that was used. Like, for example, I'm Sri Lankan Tamil, and in our own culture, we use different languages to actually communicate hierarchy. So when I'm talking to someone who is a kid, like let's say I was a kid myself, but I'm a kid myself, and I'm talking to a kid who is younger than myself, I actually use a different prefix to address that kid. So then we know that, like, I am an older kid talking to a younger kid. When I'm talking to another kid who might be older than myself, then I would actually use a different prefix to talk to an older kid, for example. When I am addressing, for example, my parents, I have to use certain kind of courtesies to communicate with them. When I'm communicating with people who might be in places of authority, the way in which I communicate with them as well is quite different. So all of this is here, the way in which our society has been structured, I'm just using Sri Lanka as an example, is quite hierarchical, and those hierarchies are very, sometimes may not be so obvious, but in other cases can be quite obvious. And what that means as well is that that there's quite a bit of power distance between people. So, for example, I can't, in my own culture, talk back to my parents, for example, because they know best for me, for example, and so therefore that kind of way in which to communicate. The language is a lot more formal. So when we're communicating with other people, there's a lot more formality in the way in which we communicate, especially if there are there's perceived hierarchies within our community. Obviously in Sri Lankan culture, for example, people in higher positions, especially in positions of authority, tend to be quite directive in the way in which they communicate and things like that. So, for example, even myself, when I came to Australia, I found it very difficult originally. Like when I would be working, I would be expecting to get directions on what I needed to do. But, you know, in Australia, where we have a lower power distance, there's an expectation that if I give you some work to do, then you would know what you're expected to do and you're able to run with it. And so therefore, you know, I found it incredibly difficult initially coming to Australia with this expectation that if someone was my manager or someone who was my boss or what have you, they would tell me and direct me on how to do it. It also would happen in the classroom because, you know, when I would go to school in Zambia and Zimbabwe, there was this whole thing where my teacher was seen as someone who knew what they were talking about. They knew the subject material, and we were just a student there to learn from that teacher. Whereas obviously in Australia, and I want to be very clear, when it's low power distance, we need to recognize it's a perception of low power distance, okay? So there is still power distance. So if I want, like, there's often this kind of thing that, oh, we don't have those kind of power distances that you have in other cultures, but we do actually have those power distances, and we do not know that very well because most of us will never be able to be the prime minister of this country. Most of us will not be able to be CEOs of the companies that we, companies or what have you. So recognizing that this whole idea that low power distance means that we don't have power distance is actually a myth. We do have power. We do also have hierarchies and power distance, but it's the perception of lower power distance. So, for example, when it came to going to university, Martin actually said that in Chinese, they have a very interesting way of communicating. Parents have an interesting way of communicating to kids about how many courses they have available to study. Martin, do you remember using that terminology that you used? That the parents say you have a great variety to choose from, which is engineering, accounting, and...
Oh, no, it's like, yeah, it's this, it's this kind of, I mean, it's a joke that my friends and I used to do when I was growing up in Malaysia, where we'd say to each other, oh, you have the freedom to choose any career you want. It's either doctor, engineer, or lawyer. And but
because parents would be expecting us to go and do these kind of studies. You couldn't even stand up to a parent and say, sorry, I refuse to do what you're telling me to do. I am going off to do something else, because again, this is what the power distance looks like within our society. I was quite surprised because I came to Australia when I was 16 years of age and was in my year 11 in high school. And when I spoke to my schoolmates and they were like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this, I'm doing this. And I was thinking like, oh, wow, like how much did you speak to your parents about this? And they were like, nothing, I made my mind up. No one's stopping me. And I was like, wow, that's amazing, because I would love to be able to go off and do what I wanted to do, but my parents would just like completely reel me back in. So I want, like with power distance, that's the perception of it. Often in also, Min-Hui wants to add to that.
I do. What I wanted to say was, as you mentioned at the beginning, where you have to look at sort of social contextual factors as well, a lot of this is true, for me at least, for my Chinese parents. A lot of it is true is because we're immigrants. And so in Malaysia, it's true because Chinese people are immigrants there as well. And that means that there's a certain systemic disadvantage that they experience. So your parents want you to go into, that your parents are going to stop you from going into something that's risky. So for me, that was when I was picking my subjects at school, one of the things my dad said was, well, the sciences, basically, he didn't say this in so many words, but it was the sciences are what I can teach you. Maths I can teach you. As the humanities, I can't. I don't have the language skills to do that for you. But I can teach you maths, I can teach you science. And the humanities, if you have to do anything performance-based, that's very, I think my parents knew that's very, very, it's risky. It's risky because there's no marking rubric, right? There's no objective right answer. It depends on your examiner, and your examiner could be racist, and I can't help you. We can't help you with that. Whereas if you went to China, middle-class kids in China, there's a lot more leeway. And you'll notice that, like, one step further, all the people who go into, like, not all the people, but a good number of the people who become pop stars in China have rich parents. And so when your parents have, so as a cultural thing, as a I guess a socioeconomic cultural thing on top of that, when you have enough, when you have enough, I guess, resources to be secure and to be reasonably sure that your children will be secure, your I guess insistence on clinging to that kind of hierarchy lessens a lot. So my parents, when they came here, they were, I mean, not, but they were all right. So I did a law degree, but I didn't want to be a lawyer, and that was okay. because you know, they didn't need a huge amount of buffer to be sure that I would be able to support myself going forward. As long as I didn't become a performance artist, that would be not okay.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much, Min-Hui. So I just wanted to use these kind of real-like examples so for us to actually see what does power distance look like in different societies, and how do they manifest as well within our own societies and what have you. But we need to remember that, like, you know, even in Hofstede's in what he did, that there are some limitations to what, like his conception of it. So I'm just going to now move to the activity, and we're going to break out into groups. I'm going to give us 15 minutes to do this activity, and I might actually break us up into 2 groups. So what I would suggest that when we do our activity in 2 groups, is it possible for us to actually divide the group in 2 halves, and one group to actually work out on some of the examples in the case study that are evident, but also for the second group within your group to think about ways in which Priya can be empowered, just so that we can utilize our 15 minutes as well as possible, and so that we don't you know, eat into that time. So I'm going to put you now into 2 main groups, and Min-Hui and Martin will go into one group, 2 groups, and I will jump between groups. Okay, how does that sound? So this is what we're going to be looking at. We're looking at, in the case studies, examples of where you can see power distance, but also what are you going to do? Because I think it's really important for us to think about how do we empower people who come from cultures that are high power distance to actually be able to have their voices heard. Is that activity clear to everyone before I put you into groups? Okay, popping us into 2 groups. I'm just going to, so I'm going to put, and then I'll go back to Callum, Min-Hui, Nick, Rosie. Okay, great. I've popped you into 2 groups, and I'm opening up the groups now, okay?
Okay. Okay, so yeah, so we identified, so we had a discussion about directness, and well, actually, Mink, you should probably talk about that, because you had the most to say.
I don't want to dominate. That's all. I feel like I dominated too much in the discussion. I'll just say I was wondering whether there were a whole lot of softeners that in Indian culture need to be being used that Australians aren't aware of. So the message they're giving is, so messages are sounding blunt, even if Australians are unaware that that's how they're sounding, that they might be being, you know, polite or even gentle in their terms, but there's stuff they don't know about. So I guess finding out more about Indian communication strategies to find out how to make it clear that everyone is wanting, that everyone's voice is wanted to be heard.
Yeah, definitely. And I think often that's the problem, like in the case study we saw with the authorities in India, is the fact that villagers and also forest dwellers don't have the voice to be able to go out and be able to be heard, because even when there is government legislation, this is federal, national legislation that protects their forests, what's happening at state level and local level with the organizations and the police and the and local government is that their voices are not being heard, and they are actually often being forcibly being pushed off their lands, isn't it? So definitely agree with that about, first of all, like the language that's used when communicating in Australia, but also like language really even in India when they are trying to communicate that they have these rights, those rights are not being taken seriously. Anything else there, Greta? And
yes, so I guess we identified a few things in the case study passage that, you know, showed a high level of power distance, and then we talked about what we could do.
yes,
So the B part. So yeah, so there was that point about the Australian climate activists who seem to dominate meetings, disregard their suggestions and make decisions they will not work in India. And the other thing was the India team feel that agenda items meetings are rushed, when they could be addressed in more detailed manner and with greater consultation.
right.
So one of the things that Lewin suggested was in meetings we can bring more structure to the conversation and say things like finished when people have stopped speaking. We could also just ask our Indian colleagues what are some of the barriers, and we can just listen and what can we do that could potentially, if they could detail what were some of the things they felt were just creating barriers. And this is my personal ones, is for a session we could just shut up and just listen. Yep. And yes, see what we could learn ourselves. So yeah.
Excellent, definitely. And so what I will do, I'm going to put in the chat, just we as a group as well, we I might just share that I think listening is very important. I might also get Martin, are you there, to share with the group about, now we're going to move away from the case study, about how we as a working group, like, you know, we talk about listening, but also building and empowering people to be able to actively participate. So just using your example of how you did that, you know, with the Senate inquiry, which is a way in which also reducing power distance.
Yeah, I mean, well, like, yeah, that's, I think like that one, I don't know, part of that was more like structural barriers, I would say, but
that's actually power distance in societies, like, because
yeah, I guess it's true. This is true. Yeah, because I think that I would say like kind of I think there's a lot that's said about how sort of a lot of communities of color, you could say, don't actively, like, aren't as sort of, I guess, active when it comes to like political issues. So, you know, like if I were to be like, oh, like if I were to be to, you know, like people like Chinese people I know, like, oh, like, did you see what Scott Morrison did the other day or something? Like they wouldn't know, right? Like they wouldn't, like, it's not really something, like this stuff is not what they pay attention to. And that's because of like power distance, right? Or if I say, oh, you know, like, did you see that thing that happened in Parliament or something like that? Because, you know, it's like, because, you know, sort of society gears up kind of Parliament as this kind of, you know, as this kind of big kind of big entity that is like far beyond, like that's beyond everyone, or at least that's what's being communicated to, that, or at least that's how a lot of communities of color perceive it. And so I think, you know, like one of the things which we did was, you know, we really wanted people to be able to increase their civic participation. So there was this Senate inquiry on family reunion visas that obviously affects like migrant communities a lot. There's like some real ridiculous things in there. Like if you want an age dependent visa, as in like you have, let's say, a grandparent that's financially dependent on you, but is living in another country and, you know, and is just on their own. And it's just on their own, they've retired and they want to move here to Australia, the waiting time is like 50 years. And which, like, I mean, not to be blunt, but like 50 years, they'll be dead by then. So 50 years waiting time, sorry, I shouldn't be clear. 50 years waiting time for that. And so, and, you know, and the costs were pretty prohibitive as well, like $2,000, etc. And so And so, but you know, despite the fact that this is an issue that affects them very closely, like people don't still feel like they can't stand up and speak about these issues. And so I think Apsara and I, we produced like this submission guide. So kind of there was a Senate inquiry about the issue, and people, and you know, like all Australian citizens can contribute to these inquiries with like a written submission or like a video or something like that. And so, you know, we knew that it was kind of hard for some people to participate in the process. And so yeah, we produced like just this guide. It was in plain English, and it was like a translation. So there was like a terms of reference, which was very like complicated and academic. Like even people that were university educated probably would have had a bit of difficulty breaking it down and figuring out what's going on there. I think even I took like an afternoon to really wrap my head around what was going on there. And so, you know, like I was able to do that. So, you know, I wrote this submission guide, and instead of like writing out the full terms of reference, wrote like kind of a bunch of questions that were more accessible to people, and kind of also gave a lot of like instructions and all that stuff, and kind of like, you know, I think we all know the Australian Parliament website is a mess. So it's a mess, and it's, you know, and it's real badly designed. It's hard to find things and whatnot. So kind of just compiling all that information and instructions on how they go about doing a submission, like kind of, you know, like their options, like they can send snail mail, they can send an email, you know, like that sort of thing, and where and when to send it. And also like stuff like making sure they're not deviating away from the subject matter, because they're very strict on whether or not on kind of what you can put in a submission and what you can't. And so yeah, so yeah, that sort of, you know, like, I mean, as Apsara said, like that's one of those activities which we did that, you know, was really focused on empowering people, especially from low power distance cultures. Yeah.
And from high power distance.
Sorry, high power distance. Sorry, misspoke there.
No, that's right. No, that's right. But that, like, the whole idea is that we need to remember power distance is all about structures and systems that are in place. And like, if we are going to actually truly empower people from high power distance cultures to be able to actively participate within our system, a system that, you know, we are able to navigate and things like that, we have to actually dismantle those structures for them and make it as systems and structures a lot more accessible. I think is very important. Yeah. Now, I also have shared, Callum, more than happy to share that submission guide with you both, with everyone as well. So I shared in here a Word document that with some just sample answers. And I think I just want to add one of the other things as well is, you know, we could actually utilize the facilitator in this with the Indian delegation. So that we can make sure that the ideas and suggestions that they are putting forward are followed up on, because often we go, yeah, great idea, whatever, but we don't actually take it seriously. If we have a facilitator and people who are carefully recording that and then following up on suggestions, then we know that people are going to be heard. The other thing as well is seeking feedback on our performance is very important, because we need to make sure that we are learning from things that we're not doing well. So I just popped that as something that can be done at the end of meetings as well. Okay, so we're going to now move on to the next part, which is about individualism and collectivism. So just some ideas for that, and I'm going to just open here. So if you can keep that slide open, this slide here, I'm going to move on to this part here, because that way I can use it. So we can see here that Australia is a very individualistic society, and when you compare that to, for example, India, which is relatively individualistic, but, you know, like if you look at a place like Vietnam, I'm sorry, collectivist, but you can see like a place like Vietnam is a lot more collectivist than even India or Japan, for example. So what does actually this mean? And I might just talk a little bit about that. So like, for example, in an individualistic society like Australia or the US or whatever, you know, we have this real thing about individual values and the fact that we make decisions for ourselves, and you know, we don't consider how our decisions affect other people. And really, it's about those kind of decision-making process that we have. In a collectivist society, much more so than in individualistic society, is this whole idea of the fact that I'm part of an in-group. And so therefore, if I'm part of an in-group, decisions that I'm making are going to affect other members of my in-group. So I carefully consider how the decisions that I make will impact other members of my in-group, because I know it could create embarrassment. Something I do, which I'm totally happy with, might actually create embarrassment for the members of my in-group. So, and then of course, the whole idea of that as well is I'm considering like it could be like embarrassment, shame, what have you, within that in-group. So when I'm considering decisions, I'm considering both myself and the members of that in-group there. And obviously, the other thing we're thinking about as well is we want to maintain harmony with our other members. So we want to be able to, if you're within a collectivist society, to ensure that you're not on the outside of that in-group. So recognizing that is very important, because if we're asking someone to do something, recognizing that those people, people like myself, for example, would be considering how this affect other people within the group that I'm part of, and how does it affect my standing within that group. So I want to just connect power distance and this together to give you some examples of how they work together. So in Japan, we can see here, you know, it's not a very high power distance culture, but it's also relatively collectivist culture. Now, when, like in a workplace, and I want to give you an example, in Australia, if you have a manager will have the best office in the building with the best view out of the office, and you know, often in a room on their own, and so therefore, like the status of being the manager is quite obvious. But in a place like Japan, for example, if I turn up to an office and I say, okay, I'm looking for person X, you know, who is the manager, you will find that everyone's sitting in an open space area, and you will find that the manager is sitting amongst the workers in the office. Now, what that actually is about is because decision-making in Japan is a lot more collaborative, a lot more consensus-based, and management don't make decisions on their own, but it actually is through consultation with their team. So of course, there's a lot more deliberative decision-making and things like that. And if a manager was sitting in an office, a standalone office on their own, then the thing is that it would actually create the sense that there was a hierarchy between them and the workers. But so we can see here, when we are looking at this model as well, is don't just look at things singularly. Think about them like the fact that there is a number of these things that can actually work together. So like I just gave you that example of how in Japanese culture, understanding the how power distance and individual and collectivism work together is quite important to understanding the nuance of why is that the manager sits in an office with all the workers within that team rather than in a room on their own, for example. The other thing as well, I just wanted to talk about in relation to decision making. I think it's very interesting as well when you compare like a country like USA is very high individualism, and like lots of Scandinavian countries are not as high in individualism, but actually relatively high. But when you ask the question about like, for example, healthcare, in the US, they say, this is my right to make a choice about which healthcare I use. Actually, when you ask the same question to people in Scandinavian countries about the fact that how come you're meant to have a relatively high individualistic streak in your culture, but you opt to pay large amounts of money for your health, for taxes, and have a public healthcare system, they actually say, well, I'm prepared to pay a large amount of money for my taxes, because I want to be able to have the best quality healthcare for myself. So you can see here, this is individualism, but the way in which the people from these two cultures are approaching that kind of question is slightly in a different perspective. Okay, so what I want to say as well is that we need to be very careful when we're looking at things like individualism, and just because everyone's in this one group doesn't necessarily mean we view this value in exactly the same way. Is there any questions about that before we move on to the activity? No? Okay, so let's move to slide number 13, where we're going to be doing discussion 3. So we'll have about 15 minutes to work on this activity here. So with this one here, if you can look at some examples in the case study of the real collective decision-making in Indian society, and also how can we shift our decision-making away from this very individualistic way in which we make decisions in countries like Australia to ones that are a lot more collective. Okay, so is that clear for everyone before I put you back into groups? Greta, is that, I see you're reading there.
I just want to take, can I just take a photo of it?
Oh yes, definitely, you can do that. I'll do that now. Okay, I'll pop it up here. So you can do that and I'll pop you into groups now. Okay, so if you can respond to that, and I'm going to give you 15 minutes in your groups to work through a response. Okay, so here we go. I'll stop sharing. Okay, so you can see like really that the nuance of that, of how we behave, can vary quite greatly. So I'm popping you into your groups, and you're in the same groups again, okay?
Again.
Whoa.
Notes. Would anyone else like to speak so that I'm not always the one who's speaking? Or shall I just take over? All right. Interrupt me if I go off track and misrepresent you. So we talked about, so yeah, the examples of collective decision making. We were talking, I think the two, I mean, there's, you know, a lot of stuff. The two main things we talked about. First thing was the Indian delegation's expectation of taking time, as in within meetings, and not rush it. So then their corresponding shock at the Australian delegation's tendency to just blast through. So that's not an example of collective decision making, but it's an example of the expectation that there would be space made for, you know, that kind of thing. And we also spoke a little bit about the way that yeah, I did. I did say that in the comments. So we were also talking about the way that I guess context feeds into this, where the case study mentions that the forest dwelling communities, in their communities, they haven't split off land into individual settlements in the way that we split off land in Australia into individual sort of house titles that are owned by one person and at the most two people. They've got a recognition that the forest, it's not that there's this forest and this bit of the forest is mine and that bit of the forest is yours. It's that we all make our living from all parts of the forest, and so then to function as a unit, we need to work together. We also talked about, this was the bit, we're getting into the bit that was mostly me talking, but we also talked about how that sort of, it mirrors a little bit the Aboriginal land councils here, where there's a council that represents, you know, a greater group, but then in legal reality, so here we've got Aboriginal land councils that mining companies are supposed to, you know, negotiate with. In India, they have these assemblies that mining companies are supposed to negotiate with. But what happens in reality is that the legal requirements can be fudged. And what happens is that power comes into it, and the mining companies come in and they pick, maybe they'll bribe one family and they'll say, we'll give you, you know, if you somehow manage to get all these signatures, or they forge signatures, or they have, you know, stacked assemblies where they'll use, you know, power distance, or, you know, just majority, or like, you know, various social things to sort of try to get people to just, you know, agree. And another thing that I would like to say is that I think this sort of discussion about relationships and collectivism really shows how the different elements that Hofstede breaks off interrelate. They're not so easily broken off into separate bits into reality, because, for example, if you want to function as a collective, you have to be, if you want to function as a functional collective, you probably do have to be more aware of your relationships to each other, which, I mean, a lot of societies like Indian Chinese societies do it through a lot more of a formalization of, hierarchy. So my parents we'll say my parents expect me to listen to them to an extent, but correspondingly, they expect to be responsible for my well-being in ways that an individual, like a legally individual society wouldn't. Like in a legally individual society, you'd say, we're all individuals, we all look after ourselves, and somehow it'll work out. In a relational collective society, you're very aware of how you relate to other people, because you need to do that to function as a group. So moving on to the part 2, we were talking about strategies that we could use going forward. Really great suggestion from Callum was the use of hierarchy rounds. So at the beginning of the meeting, just talk about this, and talk about the reality that, let's talk about how we're going to relate to each other, what power differences there are, how we all want to move forward to work through or work with them in our decision making. Apsara mentioned the removal of formalities within meetings, as in to make them less about procedure and less about, I guess, keeping to time and reaching certain goals, and more about being people working together, so understanding people. And that's where the shooting the shit thing came out, which is Nick rightly suggested that we need to make space to get to know each other. So to have, agenda space, maybe not even the agenda, but space to get to just to talk about whatever, so that we get a sense of who we are and how we should relate to each other going forward. Rosie mentioned that we shouldn't, and like it's all related, we should try to create a space where people don't feel inadvertently rushed, so that, if there's a space where, because we have all the time in the world, any kind of point, even if it's not sort of, strictly related, can be raised just in case it is relevant, and it could be very important. Have I missed anything?
No, it's great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate what your team's done. And I'll just quickly add this this activity sheet with, so if anyone wants some other suggestions that we had as well, that Min-Hui, Martin and I have, so we've just popped that in there too. But thanks so much, Min-Hui and team. But I just also wanted to add to what Min-Hui was saying, like in collectivist societies, where we have to remember they're very high context as well. So lots of communication doesn't happen in a very explicit way. And a lot of the communication is really, our job is to read between the lines, and we can pick that up in the way in which something, like people don't say directly no, they'll say no in the most roundest way possible. So it's our job to pick up the nuance on how that is being communicated to us and things like that. So we really need to think about those perspectives as well. And like we were just saying about consensus decision making is a very large part of really living in collectivist societies. And like we take it for granted as something that we've come up with, but it's actually something that has been around for thousands of years and being used very effectively in collectivist societies to make decisions as well. I'm just going to quickly go. I'm so sorry, we're running a little bit over. Do you mind if I go through a couple more and then do one more activity? Is that okay with everyone, and we can finish at past?
I'm totally okay with that, but a loo and snack break would be great for 5 minutes somewhere there.
Sure. Well, why don't we come back at 10 past?
Great.
So I think we might get started again, and I'm going to go through a couple where we won't have an activity, and then we just have one final activity, okay? So we're looking at, and I heard, I think I read in there before, Lewin asking the question about what does masculinity and femininity mean, and I kind of heard what you saying that in the thing, and I just want to talk a little bit about that as well. So I'm going to use country comparisons, and yes, to just use that. And this time around, I'm going to use Australia, Japan, and Sweden. Okay, so I'm going to do that. Use those as my examples for today. So we can see here in that there's quite a big difference between the three countries. And so just to use that to talk a little bit about it. So how Hofstede actually conceptualized masculinity and femininity was about values that are masculine values. So, you know, patriarchal societies that where masculine values are really prioritized. You know, we can see in places like in Japan, things like long working days. People in Japan cannot leave their desk at the end of a work day until their manager leaves the desk. So that could be 9 p.m. at night, for example, and you're still at office till your manager leaves, because that is the requirement of, you then might be required to go out for drinks and dinner, because remember, it's a very collectivist society. So the fact is that you go with your work colleagues and do things with your work colleagues even after work. Okay. When we have a look at, for example, the masculine, like where that also plays out, for example, the male is meant to be, if it is a heterosexual sexual relationship, the male is meant to be the breadwinner. So in Japanese society, there's been a lot of shame in recent years among working fathers, when especially with more women going into the workforce and earning more money than their male and than their husband, for example. Let's say it's their husband, and so there's been a lot of shame attached to that. There's a lot of shame attached with, for example, a man losing his job and not having income. There've been cases of Japanese men dressing up in their business suits, walking out their door and sitting in a park all day before they come back home at the end of a work day because of the shame of having lost their job, for example. So the whole idea of masculinity is how do they actually, so that kind of competitiveness, aggressiveness, you know, assert, like that kind of values. Now, when it comes to feminine societies, and I just want to be very clear, I'm not saying that Hofstede's ideas are really, some of his, like, you know, the kind of very gendered, but what he was trying to get at when he was talking about feminine values was a lot more about this kind of work-life balance, quality of life, things like people getting to spend more time with family and loved ones, doing things that you enjoy outside of, like, you know, these kind of constraints of work. Flexibility, like, you know, and we can actually see, like, as a result of that, in Scandinavian countries, flexible working arrangements are a lot more evident. Things like job sharing, staggered starting times, things like working from home, those kind of things, you know, whereas like even Australia, I know there are so many managers that cannot wait for this pandemic to be over so that people come back to 5 days a week in the office, right? You think, oh, okay, before the pandemic, you had like maybe you could have had an excuse of the fact that, okay, people don't work at home, and in presently, like if you're not at work, you're not doing anything kind of thing. Like, but we know that after the pandemic, people have proven that they're quite productive, and that, you know, having that mix of working from home and working at in the office is quite a good mix. But we can see that, you know, that whole idea means that managers feel like they don't have control of the worker. The worker is not necessarily doing all the things they need to do. So that's what we mean, what he was trying to talk about in relation to masculinity and femininity. And so we can see here, Scandinavian countries tend to be a lot more what is considered feminine, but also that means a lot more socially progressive as well, by the way. I want to be clear. So places like Scandinavia are about 20 years ahead of Australia when it comes to social policy, okay? And so things like that, because of the fact that they are not just looking at things from an economic point of view, but looking at it from economic and social and all those kind of things there. Moving on to the next one. So I'm going to talk now about uncertainty avoidance. And for uncertainty avoidance, I'm going to use examples of, I'll actually keep Japan and Australia, okay? I'll keep all three, Japan, India, and Australia. So you can see there that Japan is very high in uncertainty avoidance, and we actually have to look at the historical context of Japan. And Japan is a country that is on a fault line, and so when you think about it, there are so many things that are completely uncontrollable that Japanese people cannot control. So things like tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic activity, and all those kind of things. So what he found through his studies was that this long history of great uncertainty actually makes Japanese people incredibly risk averse. So the risk averseness comes down to, again, goes back to collective decision making as well. So if we remember, we talked about individualism and collectivism. A lot of that collective decision making comes into play. Collective decision making is going to take a lot longer than if we're making decisions individually. What it also means is that in Japan, for example, you might have plans that are 100 years long. Okay, in Australia, and we'll be looking very soon at short-term and long-termism. You know, Australia is very short-term oriented in that sense. You know, we can't even look at our leaders. We can't even make a decision for 3 years from now, let alone 30 years or 100 years from now, you know? So does that make sense? And so we can see that kind of, all of those kind of creep into decision-making in Japan. Whereas like Australia is, what I would say, you know, it is lower in it's lower in uncertainty avoidance than Japan, but of course still higher than India. And what does that actually mean? There's that we do have rules, and we do have regulations and things that we might follow, but we also have there's a little bit of room to move. Whereas when he was conceptualizing uncertainty avoidance, how he saw low uncertainty avoidance was cultures where people are more likely to take risks. If we do have rules in place, sometimes people will work around those rules and make decisions around that. So that's how he conceptualized those three there. I mean, of that concept there of uncertainty avoidance. Before I move on to the next two, because the next two will be related to an activity we're going to do, does anyone have any questions about masculinity and femininity, and maybe even Min-Hui can add to some of it as well, and uncertainty avoidance as well?
I think we had a request to put in the USA as a fourth country of comparison, if you could do that.
Sure, no worries, definitely. United States, in many ways, it's quite similar to Australia in many of the things that we have. What colors? Yeah, it's quite similar in many of the with Australia. And was there a particular question relating to that someone wanted to ask?
Yeah, it was in relation to masculinity and femininity. That was the one I was interested in, whether there was much difference, but there isn't.
No, not much. Yeah. Was there a reason why, Mink, if you would?
Yeah. I think when you were talking about working late, sorry, I can't remember now, because it was part of the definition of masculinity, femininity, and how that shows.
Well, I think, like, I mean, we can actually see in the US even more so than in Australia that like those kind of work values of people working, you know, it's incredible. In the US, they don't have any more than 2 weeks of annual leave. There are many things which are incredibly those kind of values, and Americans actually tend to be very loyal to the organizations that they work for, even when they are working in organizations that are incredibly exploitative. Like, you know, like when you think about fast food restaurants and things like that, but they are considering the fact that they're earning well below the poverty line and what have you, having to work in sometimes 60 or 70 hours a week just to make ends meet, because they can't work 35 hours and make ends meet. Yeah, you know, those kind of values. And it's in America, this whole thing about individual endeavor and you will get, do really well is very individualistic, but it's also very masculine.
Yeah.
And actually, if you watch a lot of like American media, like you will see, like especially American media that's set in the workplace, like you will always see people like late, and then kind of it's always framed as this, oh, great, you're staying on late and stuff,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very true. Yes, Lewin, sorry.
Oh, I was just wondering, I have another question, so if you're going to add a thought, go for it.
No, Lewin, you go.
Just to summarize with uncertainty, is it like low tolerance of uncertainty and therefore a high degree of like conventions that you stick to? Is that like a summary?
Yes.
So low uncertainty means you're more likely to take risks, but what you're saying is more high uncertainty. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
It's because you're avoiding the uncertainty. So what you just said about conventions is very true.
Cool. And I read something online just because I was like, wait, which way around is it? And they talked about suppressing emotions in relation to uncertainty avoidance. Is that a thing?
That's very true. In Japan, so what you're just saying there, Lewin, is very true. A lot of American companies, when they have Japanese customer service, this is now when multinational corporations started to go into Japan. They would actually, because of Japanese culture, which is actually showing emotions is a weakness, a sign of weakness. So what would happen in Japanese culture is that people were, when communicating, wouldn't often smile and things like that. And that actually is where American companies would actually say, okay, well, how do we actually make you, because smiling obviously changes the way in which you communicate and things like that. And they were like, this is really interesting because the way we communicate is that, and they actually realized that in Japan, a lot of that kind of emotions, including happiness and anger and what have you, had to be suppressed. And so that's done as a part of you don't play your cards at all, that's again, that uncertainty avoidance, that high uncertainty avoidance.
And we can move on, but I'm also curious, what some examples, for example, with Sweden and the opposite might look like.
Is this for uncertainty avoidance or?
Yeah.
Let me, I mean, you mean as in rules and things like that?
Yeah, or anything really.
Well, I've got one ready if you'd like, Apsara. A sort of low uncertainty avoidance, for example, here is our tendency to live on credit. So our tendency to pay, so mortgages to an extent, because that's attached to land, but certainly the what is it, zip pay and that kind of thing, where you can't afford it, but you're gonna rack up you're gonna buy it now on the assumption that you'll find a way to pay it back later. That's quite a risky way to live, actually. So in China, for example, not anymore, but when my friend's parents, my friend is my age, which is about 30 years old, and when her parents were living in China, because they'd just come out of essentially the upheaval of the Cultural Revolution, everyone had just basically been reduced to farmers, and everyone was really poor and really used to work, living hand to mouth. The generation that came out of that bought nothing on credit. They were like, we are not going to live this consumerist lifestyle. That's as in, it just wasn't even a thing. So US, when they opened up in the late 80s, no, the early 90s, I believe it would have been, when China opened up its economy, US credit cards went in and they couldn't make any money because people wouldn't ever rack up that amount of debt because it's too risky. We know what it's like to have nothing. But the generation that was born after that, so the generation, I guess my generation, they do live on credit. They've been the sort of international culture has gotten into them where actually you can have now and then risk defaulting on your payment later. And I'd just like to add to that high and low uncertainty avoidance can be different for different areas, obviously. So with Japan, emergency procedures, obviously, because of the tsunamis and things, the earthquake tsunamis, are very, very, very important. But for things in terms of, that doesn't mean that they avoid uncertainty in every aspect of their lives. So there are a lot of sort of like for language, for example, there's a lot, because they're also a high context culture, there's a lot of stuff that they'll say ambiguously and just leave for you to interpret, and that's fine. They're happy to sit with that in ways that Western communication wouldn't, you know. So anyway.
That's a very good point. Yeah. And actually, I wanted to add as well what Min-Hui was saying. This is why, like, I mean, you look at inventions like credit card and Afterpay. You know, Afterpay is an Australian invention. Okay, you know, these are things that come from, why is it they're invented in these countries? And because they actually are very much in fitting with the cultural norms of the societies in which they are actually being invented in, for example.
Can I make a just a historical observation there?
Yes, certainly.
So just when Min-Hui was talking about post-cultural revolution, well, you know, I'm of the generation where my parents were dealing with post the Depression. So my generation absolutely had the experience of parents who would not use credit. Credit was simply, you didn't go there because they had experienced such trauma. And I was also just thinking that when I first went to England with a credit card, which was in the mid-80s, the English didn't use credit cards, they used debit cards. And in terms of their post-Depression, but also post-World War II, the ongoing anxiety about money was right, you know, into the 80s, which for me, I'm just going to throw one more thing, interesting, that thing about cultural values that are core and non-core, because it would appear to me that there are areas where these are non-core values because they change.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. And if you actually look at what Min-Hui said, like if you look at China today, it doesn't actually fit in with the China that that Hofstede actually
in the 80s.
In the 80s, yeah.
Mm.
You know, it's actually, I would say that it's a lot more lower uncertainty avoidance than it was in the 80s.
I imagine this comparison that's being made now is made with today's power distance thing, or is it actually from the
70s?
Yeah. So it's actually about out of date because, yeah, things change.
Right. Things change.
Yes.
That's why, like, it's, I think, very important for us to know all these limitations when just looking at these models, because, you know, there are multiple limitations. Yeah, definitely. And, you know, just using example, I'm just going to jump in and just to talk about one of those examples there as well, is when you look at Japan. You know, Japan was, prior to industrialization in the 1800s, was a very polychronic society. But actually industrialization in the 1800s came to Japan and actually introduced monochronic values. So this real time-based values. So, you know, their trains, even if it's 2 seconds late, actually Japanese authorities will apologize profusely for the lateness of the train, which is a very monochronic way of looking at time, right? But actually Japanese culture, if you look at it historically, was very polychronic. So this is again a very good example of how globalization and what have you has actually had influences on societies, for example. I'll just do these last two and then we'll do our last activity. I'm so sorry, we've just been running over time, but I hope you've found it insightful, the session so far. So I'm going to combine these two because I think it's really important to combine, because I think right now we see actually there's so much interrelated, you can't really discuss them separately. So when we look at long-term orientation and short-term orientation, Australia falls well and truly with our 21 in our very short-term way of looking at the world. You know, the reason why we love Gough Whitlam is because this was a man who had a vision for this country that was so foreign to the way in which we look at the world. Does that make sense? And one of the reasons why we cannot even, like, you know, often can't understand and we reconcile Indigenous long-term thinking about how they live with the world, in the world, like how they interact and live in the world that is they are part of, you know, because it just goes, it kind of gets away from our thing. And again, I think it comes down to a lot of, like if we think about the way in which we do our management decision making, our government decision making, you know, it's so much about, you know, about, if we look at the next one, about in the moment, what do people think? I was speaking to Martin yesterday, and I heard that when they were doing the inquiry in New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian was so concerned about her polling that the polling apparently showed her that if she did a hard lockdown, it would really affect her standing in the community. That is a perfect example of short-termism at play.
Absolutely.
You know, and the fact that she, like, yes, in short-term pain but long-term gain, that like it didn't play a factor really, and that comes down to this whole indulgence and also into pragmatism. So just like moving on to the part about pragmatism, you know, like one of the things that Min-Hui said was very true. Like Chinese people before the Cultural Revolution were known, even with the very meager salaries that they would make, to have very large percentages of savings. Oh, and again, why does that pragmatism? Because in pragmatic societies, of course, there's long-term orientation, but we also think about intergenerational. So like many decisions that we make are also, we think about past generation, this generation, we think about our future generations as well. So like whenever I'm in a taxi, I don't catch taxis very often. I often will speak to a taxi driver and say, how long you've been driving taxis for, and then they'll talk a little bit about that, and then they'll talk about how they're here studying and they're like doing a PhD, or they've got a PhD from their home country, and you're like, oh, how come you're driving a taxi? And they said, look, they don't know, Australia doesn't recognize my qualifications and whatever. And you're like, oh, wow. And so you decided to come to Australia and to drive a taxi, and they'll say, yeah. And then you start asking these questions about it, and they'll say, but I'm not thinking about myself. I'm thinking about like my kids and my grandkids. And you're like, oh, so do you have children? And they're like, no, I don't even have children. Okay. But do you see where I'm coming from there? Like they're thinking about the fact that they might not, they are sacrificing
their lives
and opportunities they could potentially have in their home countries to give their children and their grandchildren an opportunity they will never have. And does that make sense? Yeah. So let's now do the last activity. I'm so sorry, I'm running out of
actually
time.
maybe we should ask people if you want to, because I'm cognizant of the fact that we're already past 3:30.
Yes, definitely. Is anyone interested in doing this final activity? I'm so sorry, everyone. I apologize for assuming.
We could work through it quickly together instead of going to
let's do that.
Let's do it together.
Yeah.
Maybe what I'll do is I'll stay quiet, and maybe if people want to jump in and answer the first part.
Spending the time to form their relationships with the people who live in the forest in the first place.
Very good point. Definitely. And they don't necessarily trust people from easily as well, isn't it? That long-term relationship. Would anyone else like to add to that?
I just know that that's really important, that sense of, so Eddie, if it's to do with relationships, then it's not a matter of an organisation saying, you know, oh, we'll send Josephine in and she can work with them and she's established a great relationship with them and now everything's gone and it's okay because Josephine's got another job somewhere else. But in fact, that means that the relationship's gone and that long-term trust, etc., has gone too. So it's important. So yeah, that's it. that sense of stability is very, very important if you're looking at long-term
relationships.
Yeah,
there's definitely, and really, you know, one of the things that we do in Australia with activism is we make everything into a campaign,
which is all short-term,
very short-term. You know, this is people's lives we're talking about, you know, and intergenerational, it has intergenerational implications because 25% of Indians still live in rural and in forested areas, for example. That's a very large percentage of people whose lives are so reliant on living in the forest as it is.
This is, how does that work in terms of the caste system?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, you can be the person who knows everything about this.
I might, if Ruchira is there, because Ruchira might actually, I want to be, Ruchira is here, and she was, the case study that I wrote is actually based on, I have to make a confession to everyone. It's based on, I met Ruchira last year in a Blockade IMARC counter conference, and Ruchira had two members from activists in India who were working with people on the ground. And so I was so blown away by Ruchira's talk that I actually wrote this case study. So maybe I'll ask Ruchira to share her insights.
Hi. So what exactly is, actually is the question? Hi, everyone. Yeah.
I was wondering how the caste system, if 25% of Indians are still connected to the forest, where do they fit in the caste system?
Oh, well, let me try and summarize. So it's actually the figure's bigger. 65% of Indians live outside the formal economy, in what is the informal economy, mostly livelihoods based. They might be urban, they might be living in urban setups, not necessarily non-urban rural setups, but they're still not in the formal economy, like, you know, like IT and the finance sector and so on and so forth. So the majority of India lives in the informal economies, which include peasant livelihoods, as opposed to big agriculture, non-marketized agriculture, sustenance kind of farming, forest, you know, kind of produce collection, those kinds of things. And the same for other South Asian countries as well, in a way, like Bangladesh and stuff. So the thing is, it's more structured, of course, oppressively so, in a rural society where villages will have separate areas where the Dalits, which are the lower castes, live versus the upper castes, and caste tensions are very strong. In most cases, Dalits are, so lower caste people call themselves Dalit. It's a name they have taken on because Dalit means downtrodden. So lower caste people most likely will not have land. They will be working as landless laborers on the lands of upper caste people. The various layers of oppression that work in that case. Adivasis, indigenous people, will be owning land because they have been on their land and tilling their land and tied to their land intergenerationally for centuries. So these are fundamental differences maybe between Adivasis versus Dalits. Now, villages in central India, in the forested part of central India, which is the Adivasi heartland, indigenous heartland, villages can be mixed. They might not necessarily just be indigenous Adivasi villages. Villages can have clusters of upper caste clusters in one part of the village, Dalit clusters in another part of the village, and Adivasi clusters in the others. This is just a sampling of kind of rural society. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Ruchira, for your insights.
Thank you.
It was really good having you on hand to quickly ask you that question. Yeah. So, I mean, just like what we can see here is that really in this kind of thing, if we're going to be doing long term, really coming up with joint strategies, I think is very important. Having milestones that we can have, like long-term, like milestones, because if we're looking at a long-term strategy, and joint evaluations, I think, of what's going on is so important. And I think celebrating some of those milestones, but not treating these things as campaigns that, you know, we can just jump out of, and really stepping up other campaigners in Australia to be able to come and support in these programs, and creating that long-term mindset is very important, because it's, at the end of the day, it's about trust, and it's about that sense that we're working committed towards a long-term strategy together. So I'm going to just quickly share. Thank you. I'll just share this, just some of the responses that we have, and I will just finalize with the last bit, okay? Just to talk a little bit about what we have just done, and maybe just run through and ask you if there's anything that you would like to share, you know, of, you know, what we've just learned, or, you know, what we've just been sharing with each other today. So I'll quickly share this. So I think, like, as you can see, we've just kind of scratched the surface in today's session, but I'm hoping that, you know, today's session's been helpful, you know, in like developing some, you know, your cross-cultural skills, and also your knowledge. And I think for me, you know, this is a very important part. The metacognition, I think, is incredibly important, because some people don't even get to that stage, but, you know, the willingness and the openness to be learning this new information, I think, is really incredible. And I think from us, what it helps us to do is to put ourselves in the shoes of other people, and actually look at things from other people's perspective, and to check our privilege all the time. Because even myself, I mean, I'm incredibly privileged, and often I find that like sometimes, because of that privilege that I have, I tend to be a lot more vocal and a lot more outspoken, and quite forward in sharing my thinking and what have you, and sometimes taking that step back and say, no, it's not my turn to talk, my turn to listen is really important. And I think embracing diversity for me is about the fact that it's a learning process. I learn so much from that. I feel that there's so much I don't know, and so much I can actually gain from listening and understanding from other people why they might do things differently. So I might go around the room, and maybe if people want to share maybe some insights, and we might start with you, Anissa, of some key takeaways from the session today.
Sure. Yeah, no, this is the second time I've done this workshop, and so I really enjoyed listening. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the parts I really enjoy is the different stories of the different cultures, and those like actual, this is what has happened in this point, you know, bringing in the history of different countries. And sometimes I feel a bit overwhelmed. I'm like, oh my God, I'll never be able to understand the history of every single country. But it's really nice to keep bringing it back to relationships and the long-termness of it all. And so it's not as though we need to know everything about every culture to be able to engage with people. It's just that we need to be open and yeah, up for learning and making mistakes in a way that we're humble and willing to say, okay. So yeah, that's what I got out of it. Thanks, facilitators and everybody. And thanks for letting me just listen and lie down. It's been really nice.
Thanks, Anissa. Greta?
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't studied any of this before, so it's all completely new. So yeah, thank you for explaining to us, and yeah, sharing your time to give us a bit more of an understanding. Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks, Greta. And Martin?
Wait, sorry, what, like?
Share some insights.
Insights?
Yeah.
Like,
Is that who I think it is?
oh, it's the minority. The minority.
Okay.
I call Apsara's partner the minority, as a sort of in joke. Yeah, I think like, look, actually maybe I'll just say like kind of something I've been thinking about. I think that like I would say the other thing is also like kind of I think it's all well and good to sort of dive into all the theory and all the sort of stuff, but I think the reality is also that alongside that, you also need to actually be, be interacting with people from different cultures. And I realize that for some people that can be like really difficult, but for me, I think that's really shaped my experience. Like I grew up in Malaysia where it's like kind of you've got Chinese, you've got Malays, you've got like kind of Indians and South Asians of all persuasions. And so it's like kind of like I know from experience that just by interacting in that manner, like you instinctually develop that cultural intelligence even without explicitly learning about it. And so I would just say to everyone to be like to think about your sort of your friendship circles, your communities, and that you sort of participate in, and how you can maybe diversify that a little more. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Martin. Excellent. And then Mink.
It's lovely to this is my first re-entry into green stuff since the beginning of the COVID last year. So that's been really lovely for me, Apsara. Thank you. You provided some, I like being back in the space and thinking about the intercultural stuff because it's always been really important to me. And something I didn't say at the start, but the more we talk about this, I just am made aware, even though I was born in Australia and have lived in Australia, I was born in Australia to parents who were not typical Australian, even though they were Australian. So that sense of what are the rules, what are the cultural rules was something, and we moved around a lot in regional Victoria, and every time we moved somewhere, I had to learn new cultural rules because we kept on not fitting in. So I've always been, when I finally went to uni as a mature age student, I became aware that, and did linguistics. So that's when I started understanding a whole lot of things about, right, that's why that and that and that and that. So it's great to be back in the space thinking about these things and connecting. I liked having a real life thing of people thinking about, we can all be being very, wanting to do the right thing and working together and working with this group of people. And we're actually, working out how to work with others in a way that's long-term.
That's right. And could I just say really quickly, because actually Mink said something that I would like to also to remind everyone is that when we're using this framework, what Mink was also alluding to is very important, is that, when Hofstede did come up with this framework, it was actually looking at Australia as an Anglo-Celtic country, with Anglo-Celtic values, so actually what Mink just said here was, I was like, oh my gosh, I did actually forget to talk about that at the beginning, but like how your family had to navigate a system that was so foreign to them was also a lot because that they were coming into an Anglo-Celtic way of doing things and being, isn't it?
Yes.
Thank you so much. And Callum?
As someone that's not particularly active in the climate movement, but more so works in community, there was so much relevance in it. And the thing that I found, I guess, stuck out was that the idea of collectivist societies and the idea of long-term relationship building, and seeing that time and time again in trying to like work in any sort of community building. Like it's really good to be reminded of.
Thank you so much, Callum. And Ruchira, would you like to add something as well?
Sure, yes. Thank you, Apsara, Min-Hui, and Martin. This is the second time that this time just kind of been able to sit back and listen in to the kind of presentation and some discussions. You know, it's like just for me, being able to, or try to apply this framework to think about the difference between activism in India and Australia is very interesting, because I use a kind of much more, kind of political ecology and environment justice kind of framework to kind of talk about those differences, more political. So some of the things, I think some of the things that comes out really strongly and well when we kind of look at it through this framework is the fact that, the collectivist society is actually giving more emphasis to, try to understand that kind of an orientation of village life and subsistence communities with which you're possibly trying to form networks and stuff. So I think one question, it'll be really interesting the next time, Apsara, Min-Hui, and Martin, when you do this workshop, is to then interestingly also think about, I think we've covered this a bit in the workshops, in terms of, what would then a model of working together look like? Like maybe kind of drawing that out of the discussions in the workshops and then kind of bringing it to the main session, because I tried that with the political framework towards the end. And I think we'll draw different kinds of conclusions from here. How can different societies work together? Or different kind of value orientations of societies work together. I think that'll be really kind of really interesting, fertile ground to explore. Yeah,
I agree. I think that even like a framework of some of the work, like things to consider when working together, I think is because we often go with our own assumptions of and our own worldviews, isn't it? So I think what you're saying is like actually a checklist of what are things that we need to make sure we do, and understanding how do we do that in a way that we can actually foster those relationships and trust, I think having that next step is important. Martin and Min-Hui, maybe we'll have a chat with Ruchira, is that okay? And then I might ask Min-Hui and then Lewin finally.
To share. So the first thing is just to tie a couple of threads that have happened together, that have already been raised together, which is I think the most so parallel with Martin's suggestion of sort of interacting with people of different cultures. I think one of the key things in this space is to grow awareness of our own cultures. And the reason it ties in with Martin's suggestion is it's sort of like the fish doesn't know it's in water thing. Often the only way that you know where your culture ends is when you see where someone else's begins. But the thing about living in Australia is that a lot of people aren't aware that cultural, and we covered this a little in the previous workshop, but that cultural assumptions get embedded in our institutions as well. They're in our law, they're in the way that our government is set up, and it makes sense. It's it's a cultural, historical, economic, whatever thing. It's a blend of everything. But when we're aware of that kind of thing, then it doesn't stop us from making mistakes, but it helps us navigate that space. So I think the key part of is understanding, as Apsara said, that the same action doesn't mean the same thing to two different, that people will impute sets of sort of understandings, different things. And my favorite example of that is adult children living with their parents, which I do. So when my parents had me, they did it with the expectation of having me as a child for life, like a pet. But part of that is that we all live, as in when I spoke to one of my aunties about this, because my aunties live in the house that my grandmother used to live in and that she died in, and they're unmarried and they've stayed living together, and they can't just understand the idea of moving out and living alone. They're like, why would you do that? Why would you remove yourself from a network like that? That's insane. And so the fact that I live at home is like, this is correct. And so when my parents moved here and they spoke to their colleagues and their friends, and then they found out that 16-year-olds were moving out of home, and And from the other side of that, we'll move them out in a controlled environment where we can still help them, we can still reach them, and they will learn how to be independent and we'll still be here. But my parents didn't know all of that because none of their Australian Anglo colleagues thought to explain that to them. They just assumed that was a thing. And so my parents were like, do they hate their children? Just boot them out at 16? This is ridiculous. But then when people who sort of, you know, are Anglo look at my situation where, like, you know, you're 30, you're still living at home. You're still living at home because it's fine. They're like, do you hate yourself? Do you have no self-respect? Like, and it's a different, like, yeah, anyway. But the second thing that I'd like to say is that my favorite definition of culture is that culture is what happens when two or more people start doing the same thing. Which gives you an indication of, I guess, how varied culture is, even within somewhere that's not a country that's not multicultural in the way that Australia is, even within, for example, China, so just so big that the way that the sort of the places that people live in, the circumstances that people live in are so big. There are so many subcultures that develop like every day out of you know every sort of subnet. People are always finding ways to separate themselves from other groups of people, or unite themselves with other groups of people. So that's just so then that I think that just feeds into the awareness that you need to keep in mind when using frameworks like Hofstede's, which is that it's so like it paints in such broad strokes that you still, which is not to say that it's not useful in some ways, but you do have to understand that that there are many subcultures and that counterculture is also a thing, right? Countercultures exist and grow up in response to cultures. People just do whatever they want in groups.
Thanks, Min-Hui. And I'll just get Lewin, but I completely agree with you that like we want to make sure that you understand that this is just a framework and that it has many limitations. It's just giving us a better understanding, but it's not the solution, so to speak. And Lewin?
Thanks. I think that, I appreciate the framework as like a place to start thinking about these things in a way, like of conceptualizing things to then stick more nuanced information to. But yeah, thank you, Min-Hui and Apsara and Martin. I appreciate it, and it's cool to be here, and also the other participants. I think like I can relate to the micro thing of like I grew up in Perth or Fremantle in WA, Australia, but I'm now in Naarm or Melbourne, and even there's like a big difference I see of like huge small town where everyone's like, I'm so bored, who are you? You seem interesting. And Melbourne's like, I have enough friends, go away. But I think that I've been thinking in general about responsibility and responsibility for yourself or for others, and who has responsibility over what. And like, I think I was thinking about that more here, being like, oh, it's all like values, and maybe there's no one right answer, even though like here in psychology, I see people like looking at collectivism and pathologizing it as being codependent. So those are my thoughts.
Interesting. I didn't realize that. So that's a very interesting way of, like, from an individualistic perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure like where people draw the lines, but codependent seems to have a lot of different definitions, but sometimes I've seen it used as like, you're not being individualistic enough.
Yeah. And it also has, like, again, languages has a connotation it's used as a very negative connotation, whereas it's where in a collective society it has a completely different, a much more positive connotation, isn't it?
Totally.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I was just going to say, if you're also in groups, that where you feel that maybe this kind of workshops can work, and if you're interested in MGV coming and doing workshops like this within groups that you're part of, please let us know. Drop us a line. It might be a community. We can change case studies to make them more relevant to, to your kind of context and things like that. But if you are interested, we are more than welcome to do this, because this is, this is a collective work, and we can come and adapt and do things like to suit the context in which you're doing, in which the spaces that you're in as well. I just wanted to put it out there for you as well, and don't feel shy. We are more than happy to work with you to adapt it to suit that kind of context too. But thank you so much, everyone, and really appreciate it.
Thank you so much to the facilitators.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, definitely. And what I can do, Callum, is I can maybe give you I'll put my phone number here and my email address as well, okay? So you can,
Great. And if anyone wants to stay around, we've got our Blockade IMARC kind of fortnightly meeting after this, where the working groups come together and we plan how to blockade that big mining conference that is destroying a lot of different places and cultures and communities. So yeah.
yeah.
I'll stop the recording.